Tonight, Mark Carney has just done something that may go down as one of the most consequential strategic moves in modern Canadian history, and the timing here is absolutely devastating for Donald Trump. With a single, almost silent assertion of sovereignty, Ottawa has reminded Washington of a geographic fact the White House appears to have spent decades comfortably ignoring. Canada controls the water, Canada controls the locks. And Canada, it turns out, controls the tempo of any trade negotiation it chooses to enter. This is not bluster. This is leverage, the kind of leverage that cannot be broken by a tweet. And here is the part that should be sinking in across boardrooms in Detroit, in Chicago, in Cleveland, in Buffalo tonight. This isn't just about tariffs. This isn't just about a trade deal. This is bigger, much bigger. Because for the first time in a generation, the United States is being forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: that the supply chains feeding its industrial heartland do not flow at Washington's pleasure. They flow through Canadian water, they pass through Canadian locks, they move on a schedule set, structurally and strategically, in Ottawa. For months, the Trump administration projected absolute confidence that pressure, threats, and tariff brinkmanship would force Canada into a rushed, lopsided deal. But tonight, that confidence is evaporating, and the world is watching. Before we go deeper, if you want clear, evidence-driven analysis on the shifting balance of power between Canada and the United States, the kind of analysis you will not get from the cable networks south of the border, subscribe to the Canadian Lens and turn on notifications. What we are about to walk through, beat by beat, is a story that the American press appears, in many ways, unwilling to tell. Here are the facts as they stand tonight. Canada maintains exclusive sovereign control over 13 of the 15 physical shipping locks along the St. Lawrence Seaway. 13 out of 15. That is not a partnership. That is not shared stewardship. That is dominance. Quiet, lawful, infrastructural dominance over one of the single most important commercial arteries on the North American continent. And because of that dominance, Ottawa has now officially refused Washington's demands to rush into new trade agreements. The official Canadian position has been documented in plain, deliberate language. Listen carefully to how our government frames this. Trade talks, the document reads, are not rushed, not risked. The mission, in Ottawa's own words, is protecting workers, securing Canada's interests. Stronger deals, not quick deals. Stronger deals, not quick deals. Read that sentence again, because it is the entire posture of this government distilled into 7 words. And that changes everything, because what Washington wanted was speed. What Washington wanted was panic. What Washington wanted was a Canadian government that would blink under tariff pressure and sign whatever was placed in front of it. Instead, what Washington got was a prime minister who simply folded his arms, looked at the map, and said no. And here is where this becomes dangerous for the American negotiating position, because leverage in the end is not what you say, it is what you can physically do. The United States can threaten tariffs, the United States can issue ultimatums, the United States can stage press conferences on the South Lawn until the cameras run out of battery. But none of that changes the physical reality. An enormous share of cross-border supply chains and critical U.S. traffic depends entirely on those 13 Canadian locks operating on a Canadian schedule, under absolute Canadian authority. They mocked Canada, they pressured Canada, they threatened Canada, and all the while, Canada was holding the key to the door they needed to walk through. That is what makes this story so explosive. But here is the part that the American commentariat has not yet caught up to: the diplomatic compounding effect. Because in the same window that Ottawa was quietly hardening its trade posture, NATO leadership issued a strategic directive that landed in Washington like a thunderclap. The alliance declared in unambiguous language that Canada must lead in securing northern and maritime logistics across the continent. Canada must lead, not assist, not support, lead. And that is a sentence Washington did not expect to read, certainly not in this decade, and certainly not at this moment in the trade cycle. This is not strength projected by the United States. This is strength conceded to Canada. And that is why this moment matters. Because for years, the prevailing assumption in American policy circles was that Canada was the junior partner, a polite neighbor, a useful market, a reliable supplier of energy and lumber, but never a peer with structural leverage of its own. That assumption is now crumbling. It is crumbling because the geography never changed. The locks were always there. The Seaway was always there. The Canadian sovereignty over that infrastructure was always there. What changed is that Ottawa, under Mark Carney, finally decided to use it. Not loudly, not theatrically, just quietly, lawfully, and with the unbothered patience of a country that knows exactly what it holds. And here's where this becomes dangerous for anyone in Washington who built a career on the assumption that economic coercion would always work on Canada. Because the entire Trump strategy, the tariffs, the threats, the public humiliation, the transactional diplomacy, was designed for a counterparty that would panic. It was designed for a Canada that would scramble. It was designed for a prime minister who would, in the language of cable news, blink. But Mark Carney is not blinking. He is not scrambling. He is not panicking. He is, in many ways, doing the one thing pressure campaigns cannot survive. He is waiting. He is waiting because he can afford to wait. He is waiting because the locks are not going anywhere. He is waiting because the Seaway opens on Canada's calendar, not Washington's. And that is the part that should be keeping American trade negotiators awake tonight. Because every day that passes without a rush deal is a day that strengthens, not weakens, the Canadian position. Every shipping season that runs on Ottawa's terms is a season that reminds the American Midwest who actually controls the throughput. Every NATO directive that elevates Canadian maritime leadership is another layer of legitimacy poured over our country's posture. The Trump administration built its leverage on the assumption of urgency. Carney has answered with the one weapon urgency cannot defeat: time. And there is something deeply Canadian about all of this. Something quiet, something dignified, something that does not need a press conference to be felt. Think about the sheer scale of the St. Lawrence Seaway and the men and women who actually operate those 13 locks. They keep the gates moving and the maritime logistics open through the brutal shoulder seasons of spring and late autumn. They have done this work year after year, decade after decade, without fanfare. They did not ask to become geopolitical leverage. They simply showed up, kept the gates moving, kept the water flowing, kept the freight on schedule. And tonight, the work of their hands has become the spine of our country's negotiating position. That is not an accident. That is a nation. That is what a nation looks like when it has been quietly building competence while its neighbor was busy building noise. We are not a loud country. We have never needed to be. We do not stage spectacles on the South Lawn. We do not threaten allies by morning and court them by afternoon. We do not govern by capricious decree. We build. We maintain. We operate the locks. We chart the channels. We keep the Seaway open. And when the moment comes, we stand on what we built, calmly, lawfully, without apology. That is who we are. That is who we have always been. And that is the Canada the world is finally being asked to see. So let us be clear about what tonight actually represents. This is not a trade dispute. This is a turning point. It is the moment the assumption of American structural dominance over the Canadian economy was quietly, decisively, and lawfully retired. Mark Carney did not need to raise his voice to do it. He simply refused to be rushed. He refused to be risked. He refused to surrender the leverage our geography handed us long before any of us were born. And in doing so, he reminded our country and reminded the world that Canadian sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a working piece of infrastructure. 13 locks of it. For months, Washington projected absolute confidence. But tonight, the confidence belongs to Ottawa, and the story is far from over. If you want clear, evidence-driven analysis on the shifting balance of power between Canada and the United States and the deeper forces reshaping North American trade, subscribe to the Canadian Lens, turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next one. Because what we just witnessed is not the end of the story, it is the beginning, and the only question now is, how far does this go?